Hello, in this video we are going to learn rules of retention or principles of retention in M365. It is one of the most important topics you need to understand and memorize. Without knowing these principles, you are risking getting your organization in trouble. In M365, we have different types of documents that we store in different repositories, and these documents would have different retention requirements. If you publish different retention policies to SharePoint site, which retention policy would win? A winning policy is determined by the rules of retention. And that's what I'm going to explain in this video. Before we proceed, it's important to understand that we have retention, which is retaining the content, and deletion, which applies to when the content is deleted. Retention and deletion actions are part of the retention policies. Retention policies in Microsoft 365 aren't just about keeping content safe. They also control when the content should be deleted. Think of retention as preserving content for a set period and deletion as a controlled way to remove it once it's no longer needed. So the competing policies that could be applied to a SharePoint site when including deletion might look like this. We have multiple retention policies as well as multiple deletion policies. Sounds complicated? Fear not, by the end of this video you won't have any issues. M365 has a specific order of processing the retention policies. All retention policies are orchestrated according to these specific rules. There is an algorithm behind it, and you need to know all of the rules. Otherwise, your retention might fail. There are quite a few rules, and in this video I'll provide you the clues that will help you to memorize them quickly and without too much effort. Rule number 1. Retention wins over deletion. Let's say you have a SharePoint site and there are two retention policies. One says retain for 5 years and the other says delete in 3 years. If we were to respect the deletion policy, we would lose the documents early. But this first rule of retention assures that we do not lose documents. We'd rather make sure that we keep them. We want to be on a cautious side here, so M365 will play it safe. Rule number 2. Longest retention wins. If we have two retention policies with different retention periods, the longest retention policy will win. One way to look at it is also thinking about keeping the items safe. The intent of both policy is to retain, and as such, we want to respect the longest retention period. So, the retain for 7 years policy wins over the retain for 5 years policy. Rule number 3, shortest deletion policy wins. Here we have two deletion policies. One says delete in 2 years, and the other says delete in 3 years. Since both are deletion policies, the intent for each policy is to delete. And so when deletion policies compete, the shortest deletion policy will win. In this example, the winning policy is a delete in 2 years policy. Okay, you might be confused about the last rule. How come we need to keep it safe, but then the shortest deletion wins? We need to be mindful of the actions that compete, such as the retention action and deletion action. So we have retention over deletion, then we have a retention over retention, and then we have deletion over deletion actions. For retention over deletion actions, we keep it safe. The retention wins over deletion. When we have two retention policies, it is all about retaining when they compete. Hence, in a way, it is also keep it safe. Longest retention wins. When we have two competing deletion actions, we are talking only about the intent to delete for both policies. Since the intent is to delete, the winner is the shortest deletion. Rule number 4. Explicit wins over implicit. This example will show you items within a SharePoint site, but the same rules apply to Exchange Online items. So here we have retention policies that were published to the SharePoint site. These policies were automatically applied to the items within the SharePoint site, and this application of retention is called implicit. Now we have SharePoint users who are not overly happy with the auto-applied policies, particularly this woman below. What they can do, they can manually apply retention labels that were published to the SharePoint site. Manual application of retention labels called explicit. And so, manual or explicit application of retention always wins. So, Jane applies a label that says retain item for 5 years. If you recall what you just learned, normally the longest retention period would win. However, since Jane explicitly applies retention, in this case, she will override implicit retention regardless of the duration of the retention. John applied a label that says delete after 10 years. Normally, the shortest deletion period would win, but since John explicitly applies this label, the number of years is irrelevant. Megan applies a label that says delete after 2 years to a document that was supposed to be retained for 5 years. As you recall, retention wins over deletion, the keep it safe rule. But again, since it is explicit manual action, it disregards the keep it safe rule because it was applied implicitly. Rule number 5. Narrow wins over wide. In Microsoft 365, we have several levels of retention policies. Organization or org-wide retention policies. These policies cover the entire organization, applying to all SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, and other content locations. Then we have site-specific policies. These apply to individual SharePoint sites, providing a narrower scope than the org-wide policies. Mailbox-specific retention policies. In Exchange Online, you can assign retention policies directly to the individual mailboxes, which will take precedence over broader org-wide policies for those mailboxes. This rule of retention ensures that policies with a narrower focus take precedence over broader settings so that the specific needs are prioritized. Additionally, you can apply retention labels to individual libraries. If you have a retention policy applied to the entire SharePoint site, a retention label applied at the library level will override the site retention policies. In this case, the retention label actually follows the explicit over implicit rule we discussed earlier, but I thought it would be worth mentioning here in this section. And the last rule, hold wins over deletion. This rule is for legal holds or e-discovery holds. Here's how it works. If there is a deletion policy in place, say to delete files after 3 years, and that content is placed under a legal hold, the hold takes priority. This pauses the deletion policy, keeping the content preserved as long as the hold is active. In this video, you learn all rules of retention. Microsoft provides a retention flowchart to visualize these rules, but I found it slightly confusing, particularly for people who do not know well all the rules of retentions, and that's part of why I created this video. But regardless, you are now well equipped to manage retention in M365 with confidence. One thing I suggest that you consider creating a custom diagram to reflect the specific hierarchy of your retention policies and labels that are published within your M365, especially if you manage complex retention needs. If you found this video useful, please support my work by liking this video and subscribing to the channel.